Hey everyone, this is Pete, and you will have doubtless noticed that I've recently played through the whole of the Lost Files of Sherlock Holmes, the case of the Serrated Scalpel, on the channel. I really enjoyed this playthrough, so I thought it'd be good to wrap up the whole thing with some more coherent thoughts outside the context of gameplay. It also gives me a chance to talk a bit more about this game, why it's important to me, and some historical context of what was going on around that period, both in video game culture and in my own life. So let's do just that. The Lost Files of Sherlock Holmes, the case of the Serrated Scalpel, is an adventure game that was developed by Mythos Software and published by Electronic Arts under their short-lived EA Interactive Stories label in 1992. It was initially released for MS-DOS PC and got an enhanced port to the ill-fated 3DO multimedia platform in 1994. It got a single follow-up in 1996, dubbed The Case of the Rose Tattoo. I played the MS-DOS floppy disk version back when it was current. I don't remember actually buying a copy, but we definitely had it in our house, leading me to believe that it was one of numerous PC games that my brother, who was an enthusiast of MS-DOS gaming at the time alongside his job working on console magazines, loaned us because he thought we might enjoy it. He was right. Back in the day, my mother and I would frequently play through adventure games together, helping one another solve them. This was in the days prior to widespread internet access, so in the case of games like this you actually had to figure things out for yourself rather than immediately reach for a walkthrough the moment you got stuck. Walkthroughs occasionally appeared in magazines, of course, but for the most part you were left up to your own devices, which is why it was often very much worthwhile to play games like this with a companion or two. My mother wasn't the only person I played this game with. My friend Ed was also rather fond of it. I forget whether or not he had a legitimate copy of his own, though given my vague memories of that period I suspect he probably had an illicit copy of ours, since there were several of us who used to share floppy disk based PC games in the schoolyard at the time. Evidently, we had turned a blind eye to the European Leisure Software Publishers Association's notorious Federation Against Software Theft magazine ads, which promised a £1,000 reward for anyone dobbing in distributors of copied games and applications. This is getting somewhat off the point of Sherlock Holmes, but it's an interesting story. It seems that not everyone laughed off these woefully poor adverts as easily as we did. The magazine Commodore Format once posted a letter from a reader who strongly objected to the adverts on the grounds that they encourage young vulnerable children to think that a phone call will lead to £1,000 very easily. They claimed, "It has caused a lot of ill feeling between boys who were friends and then fell out, and thought this was a way to get back at one boy, causing unnecessary upset to the families." Elspeth's response, delivered via the organisation's General Secretary Roger Bennett, was that, until the anti-piracy advertisements began to appear, the problem had reached a point where members of this association who produced the computer software were losing very substantial revenues as a result of the illegal and criminal activity of making copies of original games and software in breach of the 1988 Copyright Act. He went on to claim, without citation, that 80% of computer users in the entertainment sector were never buying original software at retail price, but were using nothing but illegal pirated copies. Commodore Format actually sided with the reader to a certain degree, noting that Bennett's response implies that they've halted the problem or reversed it, but that, sadly, there is no evidence to suggest that this has happened, so it's debatable whether the adverts have caused anything more than acrimony between young friends. They quite rightly noted that they do give the impression that money is easily obtained for simply telling on someone who copies games, but the reward would only realistically go to someone who uncovered a major breach of copyright, such as the mass copying of games for resale. Anyway, I digress. My friend Ed had a copy of this game, which may or may not have been illegitimately acquired as a result of how easy it was to copy that floppy back in the day, and it was something that we both loved. We really loved it. In fact, we loved it to such a degree that we came up with our own cartoon strip based loosely on ourselves, in which Ed cast himself as Edlock Holmes, and I, in my Popstar Pete incarnation, a reference to my musical abilities that were quite considerably ahead of most other folks at our school at the time, took on the role of Watson. In practice, the strips had little to do with the real Sherlock Holmes, though we did, possibly inadvertently, correctly parody the relationship between Doyle's Holmes and Watson, in that Edlock Holmes tended to be the one who did all the work, while Watson sort of stood around making stupid comments. We played up the comedic angle of this considerably by exaggerating the two characters' personalities, and Edlock Holmes certainly wasn't above behaving in a clownish manner himself on a fairly regular basis, but in retrospect it's quite funny how we'd subconsciously absorbed and reflected that classic relationship, even at the tender age of 11 or 12 as we were at the time. One thing which struck me heavily back at the time I first played The Case of the Serrated Scalpel was the strength of the narrative. And indeed, revisiting it more recently, its emphasis on strong writing, albeit with the odd typo or grammatical error here and there, is a real strength of the experience as a whole. It's a game that's very much designed to be read rather than listened to, hence the fact that any digitised speech, even in the CD-ROM version, is limited to the introductory sequence and occasional cutscenes. The rest is pure text. As an aside, the 3DO version actually replaces the original game's animated portraits with full motion video and speech for all the dialogue between the characters, though it leaves all narration as pure text. It's an interesting contrast, and the acting is actually not all that terrible in the 3DO version. It does require that you have a means of playing 3DO games, however, which is a bit much to ask for some people. But anyway, yes, that EA Interactive Stories branding, which to my knowledge was only ever used on the 2 lost files of Sherlock Holmes games, isn't just for show. This is very much a story-heavy game, and indeed some adventure game veterans may find that The Case of the Serrated Scalpel actually does things a little differently from many other adventure game titles that were around at the time. Probably the most notable thing is that the game is primarily driven onwards through dialogue rather than object manipulation. That isn't to say that there are no used thing on other thing puzzles in the game, but rather the main emphasis is on carefully examining your surroundings so that Holmes acquires knowledge, which he is then able to make use of in discussions. Unlike many other games, the information that Holmes acquires is not represented as items in his inventory, nor does he have a Gabriel Knight-style list of topics that he knows about. The Case of the Serrated Scalpel simply requires that you, and by extension Holmes, have noticed a particular detail at least once in order for it to become a topic of conversation. For example, during a late game sequence in which Holmes is speaking to a zookeeper about a murder victim who at first glance appears to have been mauled by a lion, all it takes to deduce that said zookeeper has a special relationship with the lion under suspicion is a quick glance at a large picture on the wall representing said big cat. Once you've made a mental note of that, you can then steer the conversation in an advantageous direction. In some respects, the structure of The Case of the Serrated Scalpel actually has more in common with visual novels than more puzzle-centric adventure games. You can definitely draw some parallels between it and the Japanese approach to the adventure game, in which progress tends to focus on simply taking all the possible actions in a scene before automatically moving on, rather than necessarily having to solve puzzles as such. This narrative-centric approach has aged quite gracefully from a modern perspective. The Case of the Serrated Scalpel rarely puts roadblocks in your way like some other adventures, and it's pretty rare that one can accuse it of so-called moon logic. There are a lot of red herrings throughout the adventure. Indeed, Holmes' inventory is positively bulging with items that have nothing to do with the investigation at hand by the conclusion of the adventure, and some initially relevant-seeming items turn out to be a bit of a dead end. But there are very few cases in which it's not at all clear what you're supposed to be doing. This gives the game a strong amount of constant forward momentum, which prevents it from getting boring or frustrating, and this fact is supported by the way in which you're pretty much always presented with multiple possible avenues of inquiry to pursue. As such, if you find yourself stumped with one particular narrative thread, you can investigate something else instead. Interestingly, it's this precise aspect of the game that I'm praising it for that caused some reviewers to level some fairly harsh criticism at The Case of the Serrated Scalpel back in the day. For example, Computer Gaming World issue 103, after making inexplicable comparisons between Mario and Holmes, noted that Scalpel tells an unusually good story and it is filled to the brim with audiovisual niceties, but it has one crucial shortcoming. It is not a game. It has the appearance of a game, but in reality it is just a series of animated vignettes, strung together in linear sequence, with the player asked to do little other than prod the whole affair into motion every few seconds. It is no more a piece of interactive fiction than a flipbook is an interactive movie. CGW's reviewer Charles Ardai cites the game's scientific investigation sequences as a prime example of this, noting that the player does not choose which chemicals to mix, Holmes does. The player does not choose which tools to use, Holmes does. Ardai does admit that it is perhaps unreasonable to expect the average video game player to know exactly which chemicals and tools to use while investigating evidence. I know I certainly wouldn't have had a clue what to do when I played it at the age of 11 or 12, but also claims the rest of the game unfolds in the same way. The player's job is never to decide what to do, he says. It is to figure out what the right next move is. The computer already knows, always, and then to make it. I take a bit of issue with this as a criticism, because what Ardai is describing here is just how adventure games work. They're always a case of figuring out what the right next move is, and of course the computer knows what the next move is. They are the game master, to use tabletop gaming parlance, after all, guiding you on your journey through the story. So it's not entirely clear what Ardai was expecting here. Complete freedom to do as you please? Perhaps. A game must give the player the freedom to not only do things wrong, says Ardai, but to do things right in a variety of ways. The goal should be to simulate the results of all possible actions, not to allow only one set of actions to take place. While I don't disagree with this assertion in principle, in practice we still don't truly have that level of freedom in games today, even in more sandboxy titles that purport to offer as such. So to expect something along these lines in 1992 is kind of baffling. Even in more freeform narrative-based tabletop gaming, a game master is near essential to ensure that play sessions and the overall campaign have something of a sense of structure and progression. Besides, Ardai's description of the case of the Serrated Scalpel as being strung together in linear sequence rings somewhat hollow given what I described earlier about the multiple parallel narrative threads. In fact, one of the game's greatest strengths is that it is not linear. Yes, there is a natural progression as you uncover various details of the plot, and the various threads all converge on a final conclusion, but at any given point in the game you generally have several different possible things you can explore. Mike Gerard, reviewing the CD-ROM re-release of the game in the August 1994 issue of the UK's PC Zone magazine, had similar criticisms to make, noting, in mock Doyle-style dialogue between Holmes and Watson, that it would appear that the case of the Serrated Scalpel is in many respects lacking in what one might term as gameplay, noting that things are from the start a little too simple, levelling criticism at Watson's automatic recording of every conversation in his journal, and expressing surprise that it's almost as if they being both the developers and the in-game characters, wanted me to solve the mystery. Those that will not speak on a first acquaintance seem to suddenly spout information if I persist with friendly questioning. I enjoy a challenge to my intellect, not being led by the hand in this namby-pamby way. Again, this isn't necessarily an incorrect description of how the case of the Serrated Scalpel unfolds, but from a modern perspective I wouldn't say this is worthy of criticism. In fact, many modern players note that it can sometimes be difficult to go back to older adventure games precisely because what you're supposed to do next is so often unclear, or progress is locked behind a series of strange, unusual and sometimes illogical seeming actions that you're expected to figure out how to take. The case of the Serrated Scalpel neatly sidesteps this criticism by placing the emphasis on the story rather than puzzle solving, and in doing so, it becomes a satisfying game that is rarely, if ever, frustrating to engage with. The biggest strength of the game by far is the atmosphere it creates, and this is something that both reviewers back in the day and modern commentators can at least agree on. The beautiful 256 colour VGA graphics are enormously evocative of 19th century London, and the soundtrack by industry legend Rob Hubbard is some of his finest work, making heavy use of leitmotif techniques and recurring melodic sequences in a variety of contexts to give the entire score a wonderful sense of consistency and coherence. These more immediately obvious aspects of the presentation are supported firmly by the quality of the writing in the game. As previously mentioned, there are one or two minor grammatical errors and typos in the script, but in a title as text-heavy as this that can perhaps be forgiven, particularly when the text descriptions of in-game objects, locations and characters give such wonderful stimulus to the imagination. There's a variety of detail throughout the game that is largely irrelevant to the story at large, and some more traditional adventure gamers may take issue with this to a certain degree, but it's all in service of creating a wonderfully convincing game world, helping you to understand the context of what is going on and truly get inside the heads of the main characters. In response to the aforementioned reviewers' criticisms of the game, you don't play the case of the Serrated Scalpel to have your brain taxed by puzzles, because it was never designed to be that kind of game. It was specifically branded as an interactive story, remember? And that's exactly what it provides. A story that you progress through at your own pace and which you can explore in as much detail as you prefer, be it through simply making a beeline through the main plot to solve the mystery, or drinking in all the incidental descriptions and seemingly irrelevant detail along the way. Both are perfectly valid and enjoyable ways to spend time with this game. And it's worth noting that despite the negativity we've looked at in detail from these two specific reviews, from a more broad perspective the game was fondly regarded, particularly in markets outside the UK and US. German and French magazines appeared particularly fond of it back on its original release, and in more recent years it's been frequently acknowledged by press and public alike as one of the best adventure games of all time. It's just a shame that at the time of recording there's no easily accessible means of playing this game on modern systems. It's yet to see a re-release on digital distribution services such as GOG.com or Steam, though it is worth noting that it's compatible with the popular Scum VM adventure game utility, making it a breeze to actually get up and running if you have the original game files. It's actually getting those original game files that may be the sticking point for some, and no, I'm not going to tell you how to do that in this video. You're a clever person, you're watching my channel after all, so you'll figure it out. So anyway, that's the lost files of Sherlock Holmes, the case of the Serrated Scalpel, one of my all-time favourite adventure games, and a title that I was long overdue to revisit. I've had an absolute blast playing through this wonderful game for the first time in about 30 years, and believe me, saying that makes me feel really old. And I highly recommend that if you enjoy a good story-centric gaming experience, you should definitely give it a go for yourself. Or, just watch my playthrough if you haven't already. And on that note, it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.